Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. We have yet another severe weather threat on tap for today, pretty much for this area from southwest Oklahoma down into northwest Texas. There will be a damaging wind and large hail threat with these storms. The good news is that the tornado threat looks pretty minimal. So that's some good news with this system, but it's a severe weather threat nonetheless with a damaging wind and large hail threat. So before we dive into the data, let's take a look at who's in and who's out. So as far as the slight risk, level 2 out of 5 goes. We've got places like Oklahoma City, Weatherford, and Clinton, down toward Lawton and Altus in Oklahoma. Then as we move into Texas, places like Wichita Falls, Childress, Paducah, down toward almost the I-20 corridor, down toward Abilene there, and places in between. So if you live near any of these cities, in Texas, Wichita Falls, Childress, Paducah, places like Graham, Bowie, Archer City, places like that, you are on notice for these storms today. And then in Oklahoma, places like Oklahoma City, Norman, Weatherford, Clinton, down toward Lawton, and Altus. So if you are near any of those areas today, you're going to be having the threat for some supercells with the threat of large hail and damaging winds. And now let's dive into some of the data we're seeing. So this is our satellite imagery. And you'll notice when we try to look for these kind of swirlies in the water vapor imagery, those are our troughs. And we can see we have a couple up here, one centered across the northern plains and one kind of out here over the northeast. But really nothing down here in the southern plains. There's really not going to be a well-defined trough, at least a high amplitude trough, that's going to be the main driver for storms today. And if we look at our 500 millibar map, so this is our winds at about 18,000 feet off the ground. And you can see the flow here is pretty much out of the due west. This is what we call zonal flow. So when we have more zonal flow like this, we don't have a ton of those high amplitude troughs to impact our target area. And as a result, it's going to be these kind of smaller little kinks in these height contours here, these little sort of short waves, as we call them, that's going to help initiate storms later this afternoon and evening. So this is our current 500 millibar map, or at least our 12Z 500 millibar map from about 7 a.m. this morning, Central Daylight Time. We go down to 850 millibars, so about 1 kilometer off the ground. And you can see here we have kind of this low-level circulation here with fairly strong low-level jet. These are the winds at about 1 kilometer off the ground, which help pump the air from whatever source region there is into our target area. Now, one thing that's a little bit concerning for severe weather potential, at least for today, is the fact that these 850 millibar winds are coming out of the kind of the south-southwest. And well, what resides down here? Well, that's going to be warm, dry air. So we may have quite a bit of a cap today on the atmosphere thanks to this warm, dry air aloft just above the surface. What that's going to do, it's going to provide a lid on the atmosphere and prohibit storm development for much of the afternoon until we get a little bit more forcing to impinge into the region and allow these kind of mid-levels to cool and that cap to erode. So that's our 850 millibar map. We do have somewhat of a low-level jet in place, but it's kind of pumping that dry air in for now, at least just off the surface. If we take a look at some soundings here. So these are the weather balloons that go up. They send these up every morning at 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time, and we get back what we're seeing. So this is the Oklahoma City, or Norman, Oklahoma, sounding from this morning. And you can see here a couple things. We do see that layer of kind of dry, warm air aloft just above the surface that's going to be stubborn today to erode because we don't have a big, strong trough to help erode this cap pretty efficiently. This cap is going to linger for much of the day, and as a result, I don't think we're going to see storm development for much of the day, at least in the target area. It's going to have to wait until we do have some sort of mechanism to erode that capping inversion. Another thing we can notice about the trough here, we have very meager moisture quality here at the surface. So this red profile is our temperature profile in the atmosphere, the green profile our dew point profile. And you'll notice that we've got, first of all, pretty decent temperature dew point spreads here. Only 44 degree dew point here at the surface at Norman. And you can see this moisture is very, very shallow. It only extends up a very short distance into the atmosphere before that dry, warm air takes over. So our moist layer is very, very shallow here, which is not a great thing for storms. And when you have this kind of dry air aloft throughout the entire profile, what happens is something called dry air entrainment. So these updrafts, these storm updrafts that go up, you can pretend this is a cloud, poorly drawn storm updraft. But when it entrains this sort of dry air, what happens is the updrafts get pinched, and you see kind of these meager sort of what we call turkey towers often. These towers that struggle to get going from this kind of cap in place and this dry air aloft. So storms, I think at first, are going to really, really struggle to get going, and then we'll have a short wave kind of come in, a little bit more forcing from a weak surface low that's set to develop throughout the day today. Once we get a little bit more forcing, that cap is going to be a little bit more easily broken, but I don't think that's going to take place until probably late this afternoon, probably 5 p.m. or so, Central Daylight Time and after, for places highlighted in that slight risk and marginal risk area. So let's look at our surface map here. So we'll start here to the north, and we're going to take a look, and we do see we have some sort of cold front in here. You can see the winds shift. The winds here to the west of this front are out of the north or north-northwest. Winds to the south of this front are out of the south or south-southeast. So we have kind of a convergence zone here, a little bit of a wind shift. This is a little bit of a cold front. And what's going to happen is it's going to sag a little bit to the south as we go through the day today. So it's going to set up somewhere, probably the North Texas Panhandle, far northwest Oklahoma. But because we don't have a strong sort of surface low out here to the west, it's not really going to go anywhere. You can see we have about 10 to 15 knot winds to the south of it, pretty much the same thing to the north. So this front is not going to be able to go anywhere. So it's going to sag somewhere in here and kind of stall out in here. So the cold front shouldn't really be a player in today's severe weather threat. And let's go to the south here. We'll take a look at our Texas sector here. So we are going to take a look at our dew points here. We see we have about 50s dew points up pretty much to the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area and areas to the south with 50s dew points here. The best moisture in the 60s is confined down here to South Texas and the Texas Gulf Coast here. Again, without a strong surface low out here that's going to really strengthen these surface winds and allow them to back kind of out of the southeast, we're not really going to be able to pump this best moisture up into the region today. Because we just don't have that strong sort of mass response, the strong response from the winds at the low levels from a strong surface low out here. When we have a strong trough out to the west, and let me kind of pull up this map here again. When we have a strong trough out here to the west, high amplitude, lots of lift, when the winds traverse the Rockies here, what happens is we get something called Lee cyclogenesis. So we get a surface low to develop on the east side of the Rockies down here. And what that does is it allows winds to strengthen. We get the circulation out here, so the winds out here in sort of the Texas area pumping that moisture into our target area would be out of the south or southeast and would strengthen. So we would really get this moisture to pump up northward. But we don't have that today because we have this kind of zonal flow. So while we do have some flow that's traversing the Rockies, and we will get some sort of response here in terms of lee cyclogenesis to the lee of the Rockies, we will have a lee surface cyclone in place. It's not going to be a real strong one. So we're not going to really get that response we see with a very strong trough, very strong surface cyclone. So with that being said, it's going to be tough to pump this really good low-level moisture up to the north today. But we are going to get probably low to mid-50s dew points up into southwest Oklahoma, northwest Texas. And that should be adequate to at least gradually moisten the low-level environment. One thing we have to watch for in these kind of low moisture scenarios is what we call mixing. And what happens with mixing is when we have the sun shining, it kind of heats the surface and allows air to rise. And what we get is air that rises and mixes with the air above it, and the air above mixes down below. So we get kind of this sort of mixed air mass here in the low to mid levels. Well, when we have this kind of strong cap in place, that doesn't really tend to happen as much because, again, there's a lid on the atmosphere, so stuff down here can't really break that cap. So as a result, I don't think we're going to have to deal with too much mixing today. Oftentimes, when we don't have a strong cap, we see mixing and dew points will crash into the low to mid 40s and really temper the severe threat. I do think dew points will hang out into the low 50s today. I don't think mixing is going to be too much of a concern. So we will have at least meager low-level moisture here today for supercell development. So given the winds out of the south at the surface and kind of a very, very weak low-level jet, we have a low-level jet in place right now, but that's going to weaken as we go through the day today. You can see kind of the progression here. That low-level jet lifts off and weakens throughout the day. So we're left with kind of meager wind shear, at least for tornadic supercells, and that's why the tornado threat is going to be really, really low today. Number one, because the moisture near the surface is really, really lacking, and number two is because we don't have a lot of low-level wind shear to work with in today's setup. But you can see from these soundings here, we do have very steep lapse rates aloft. The lapse rate here in this layer above 9 degrees Celsius per kilometer. That is pretty insane. And that's just the rate that temperature decreases with height. And when temperature decreases really quickly with height, we get updrafts that can be very, very strong, and you get very rapid rising motion in these layers. And as a result, you can get hailstones that get lofted and lofted and lofted until they get really big, and then they'll fall out. So large hail, definitely a threat today with any storm that can fire. This, again, is the Oklahoma City sounding from this morning. We go down to Fort Worth, much of the same, this kind of very steep lapse rate plume here aloft. So large hail, definitely going to be a threat today, as well as damaging winds. When we have these kind of dry low levels, these dry sort of subcloud layers, that promotes more outflow dominant storms. And so dry microburst is going to be a threat today, especially with southern extent here down into the marginal risk area, down toward the Midland, Odessa areas, and down into West Texas there. I think dry microbursts will be more of a threat today down there, given the dry subcloud layers. Up to the north, up in northwest Texas, southwest Oklahoma, kind of the same. We'll have high sort of what we call temperature dew point spreads here at the surface, so that difference between the surface temperature and the surface dew point is going to be pretty high today. And we'll take a look at the models in a second to give you a picture of what we might see later on as far as that goes. But these kind of dry low and mid levels allow for a lot more downbursts to happen. So damaging winds definitely a concern today, as well as large hail. But again, the tornado threat looks to be very, very low with today's setup. So this is going to be some model data now. This is the 12Z NAM, so that came out at 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time this morning. You can see evidence of that zonal flow, but we do get a little bit of a trough to develop here out over the desert southwest here as we go through the day today. We get a little bit of a reflection of some sort of trough here. But again, over the target area, we're going to remain fairly in sort of a zonal flow regime. This trough here is going to be a player for tomorrow's severe weather setup, which we'll do in a future video tomorrow morning. But as far as today's setup goes, we're going to have to rely on that zonal flow and these little sort of kinks in these height contours here. And so you'll notice here, this is at 700 millibars, so just below that kind of 18,000 foot layer. As we go through the day today, you can start to see these little sort of kinks in these height contours here. And that's going to be just enough to get storms to go here, just ahead of that. So in kind of southwest Oklahoma, northwest Texas, we're going to have just enough forcing to get storms to go here. Given the lack of overall sort of strong forcing, these storms may struggle to breach that cap, and that cap may be stubborn. So we may have a little bit of that cap that lingers on throughout the late afternoon and early evening hours. So these storms may struggle to become surface-based as well. If we had a real strong, deep digging trough here, wouldn't be worried about the cap. It would erode pretty efficiently. But today, since we don't really have that, we're just kind of relying on these very subtle sort of impulses. I don't know that that cap is going to erode fully, and we may end up having kind of elevated storms, again with a large hail threat and perhaps a damaging wind threat as well from downbursts. But elevated storms are sort of not quite as potent for severe weather as surface-based storms are, but we're going to have to monitor that. If we do get surface-based storms, then the large hail threat and damaging wind threat may be a little bit higher, a little bit more robust convection there. So down at 850 millibars, we'll take a look at our low-level jet. You can see it's in place here throughout the morning today, 50 plus knots here across the southern plains. But again, that's going to move off to the east and kind of dissipate as we go through the day-to-day. There's still a little bit maybe of some semblance of some remnants of that low-level jet hanging around in northwest Texas and southwest Oklahoma by this evening. This is going to be at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. But again, I think the wind shear is just not going to be adequate for tornadic supercells today. But we do get an increase in the low-level jet after dark here. By about 10 p.m. Central Daylight Time, we see this low-level jet kind of ramp up here across the target area. And that may help things at least organize perhaps into a little bit more of a kind of line segment sort of mode. And any discrete supercell that remains could intensify here, get a little bit more rotation, a little bit more supercell structure to it, given this low-level jet ramp up after dark. So let's zoom in here. Let's take a look at our surface pattern. So you can see here not much going on at the surface pattern, but we do get a little bit of this surface low development out in far eastern New Mexico and west Texas here by early afternoon today. So we do have some semblance of Lee cyclogenesis here. Again, there's that kind of sagging cold front. Again, it's not going to really be a player in today's event. It's going to be, actually, the cold front looks to be kind of somewhere in here. There's going to be your wind shift. There's your surface low at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time. We move on throughout the day. This is by 7 p.m. We have that cold front kind of sagging a little bit there into the Texas Panhandle, northwest Oklahoma, as we discussed. But again, it's not really going to be a player in today's event. We may get a little bit of storm activity to fire here just at the tip of that surface low in western Oklahoma. But that's going to be well removed from the best moisture, so would not expect that to be a significant threat as far as severe weather goes. But down here in southwest Oklahoma, right at the tip of that surface low, sort of, and then down into northwest Texas. So places like Altus, Frederick, Lawton, and then down into Texas, places like Childress, Paducah, Wichita Falls. Right in there is going to be, I think, the sweet spot for storm development today. Right at the tip of that kind of broad surface low here, to the south of that cold front is going to be where you're going to see the most potent storm development. And then down along kind of this dry line here, you can see kind of weak convergence here at the surface. Down along kind of the dry line there, that boundary between that moist air and the dry air to the west, you can see there's our dry line there. That may be a focus for storms as well later on. But again, these are going to be much more removed from the best kind of parameters up here in southwest Oklahoma, northwest Texas. So these storms are going to be pretty tame down here. Perhaps some dry microbursts, some lightning, perhaps some hail as well. And the fire threat may be an issue today down there as well as behind the dry line here. So again, this is kind of just a sort of more marginal sort of severe weather threat, but a severe weather threat nonetheless. And we do see we have enough instability, enough moisture up here, low 50s dew points up here into southwest Oklahoma by 7 p.m. tonight. Let's take a couple of soundings here and take a look at what we're seeing. So this is going to be in southwest Oklahoma, and you can see these temperature dew point spreads are very, very high. It's what we call an inverted V type sounding, because the dew points are very low down here, very steep lapse rates, very warm air at the surface, so you get kind of this inverted V shape with the sounding here. So again, there's a little bit of a cap remaining there. Again, we talked about how stubborn that might be to erode today, just given the lack of overall forcing. But we do have quite a bit of instability here, over 1,000 joules per kilogram of CAPE. Dry subcloud layers, so downburst winds definitely going to be a threat today. And large hail as well. You can see very, very steep blast rates here aloft remain throughout the day here in the mid-levels that will promote large hail growth in these storms that fire. But you'll notice here the photograph, very kind of weak low-level shear here. Not too much curvature in the low levels, but there is a lot of deep layer shear. So strong shear for supercells, and there is a decent amount of what we call streamwise shear, streamwise vorticity here in the low levels. When we talk about streamwise vorticity, we're talking about our storm relative wind. So here's our storm motion vector right here. And if we draw a vector to our hodograph, that's our storm relative wind. So it's the wind that the storm feels. Now, if we draw our horizontal vorticity vector, or amount of spin, sort of, in the atmosphere, in the horizontal at a certain level, it's going to be always to the left and perpendicular to the hodograph. And when these two vectors are parallel, that's what we call streamwise vorticity. And that's a lot in cases where we have parameters for tornadogenesis, for tornadoes. When you have a lot of streamwise vorticity in the low levels, that is a favored case for tornado genesis and tornado maintenance. In this case, when we have a little bit of convective inhibition here, a little bit of that cap remaining, and we have quite a bit of streamline vorticity here in the low to mid levels, what that's going to do is that promotes supercell structure. So these well-structured supercells. So we may see some very solid supercell structure from a photographic perspective, at least today. These storms may be very pretty. You may get kind of those pancake stacks to develop, those classic sort of pancake stack supercell structure to develop. So keep an eye out for that if you are a storm chaser today. That is going to be something to watch out for. But again, tornado threat is going to be very, very minimal given the dry low levels, the lack of low-level shear, but large hail and downburst winds are going to be the main threats today. Down into Texas, kind of the same thing, a little bit closer to the better moisture, so better chance to erode that capping inversion fully. But again, you can see those kind of inverted V sort of soundings here. Much of the same, strong, steep lapse rates, large hail threat, damaging downburst wind threat as well. Tornado threat going to be pretty minimal today, but long photographs do mean that supercells are possible. So let's go ahead and look at some of the convective allowing models here. We'll take a look at the HRRR model. First, again, these are just kind of best guesses, best estimates at what the radar is going to look like throughout the day today. So take these with a grain of salt, but this gives you kind of just a picture of what the radar might look like today. So this is by 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Not much in the way of storm development here out in southwest Oklahoma, northwest Texas. Again, that cap going to be stubborn to erode. And then once that low-level jet ramps up after dark, I think that might help get things going. And you do see some evidence of storm development here in western Oklahoma. The HRRR is keeping northwest Texas pretty dry. And the HRRR tends to do this in these situations. If we look at our dew points here, I have a feeling that the HRRR is over-mixing the dew points. And over-mixing, we talked about mixing earlier. So yeah, the HRRR is actually quite slow to bring those dew points to the north. It eventually does bring them in, but doesn't really convect, which is interesting. Perhaps too much of a cap that remains. Not quite sure what's going on here. If we take a sounding here, out ahead, and yeah, you can see the HRRR is not really liking the full erosion of that cap, so going to keep storms at bay, at least in this model, and any storms that do fire are going to be elevated storms at best. Let's look at a couple of the other models here. We'll take a look at the NAM 3 kilometer. Let's go back to our simulated reflectivity here. So let's go, this is the NAM 3 kilometer, so the higher resolution NAM, and you can see that the NAM 3K is a lot more bullish on storm development here by about 6 to 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. It has pretty potent storms here in southwest Oklahoma, kind of northwest of the Lawton area, south of the Elk City area, and then some more storms here kind of along that dry line to the south. So Wichita Falls, places like Vernon, Wichita Falls, down to the south, will have a storm threat as well, at least on this model. Then as we go through the night, we get kind of, storms kind of linger for a little bit and then kind of evaporate there. Then kind of regenerate over Oklahoma. Should be some beneficial rain, maybe some lightning and thunder for Oklahoma City area tonight, which is going to be much needed. Oklahoma is suffering from quite a bit of drought right now, so some rain for Oklahoma going to be nice as far as that goes. But for the severe threat, the NAM 3 kilometer definitely a little bit more bullish than the HRRR as far as storm development goes tonight. So this is the WRF ARW model, much of the same, kind of struggles to fire storms before about 8 p.m. or so. Then we do get storms to fire in southwest Oklahoma, northwest Texas, but they're going to kind of remain a little bit more tame, I imagine. If we take a sounding here from just south of those storms in Oklahoma, you can see we still don't get that erosion of that cap. Very dry, low levels, capping remains. So these storms, I think, may be more and more likely to be elevated storms, which is going to temper the overall severe threat. Large hail, again, is a threat, perhaps some damaging downburst winds, but overall not too much of an issue. This is the NSSL WRF, a little bit more bullish on storms, kind of closer to the NAM 3 kilometer there. Some supercell development there in southwest Oklahoma, some more down along the dry line there in northwest Texas, and down into far west Texas, the I-10 corridor, down toward Fort Stockton. So the models kind of are struggling to handle today, at least these convective allowing models. We'll take a look at the FV3 here as our last sort of model. And we do get kind of scattered storm development here across western Oklahoma into northwest Texas by about 7 p.m. So if I had to guess, I would say that storms perhaps are going to remain a little bit more elevated here, that cap going to struggle to erode, particularly with northern extent here into southwest Oklahoma. Northwest Texas perhaps going to be a little bit more likely to erode that cap, get more surface-based storms, although for the entire area here, the low level is going to be very, very dry, so the tornado threat is going to be pretty much nil today, which is great news, but large hail and some damaging downburst winds are going to be the main threats for today. So that's going to wrap things up here for now. Again, people who are in and out of the current slight risk, level 2 out of 5, places like Oklahoma City, Norman, Weatherford, Clinton, down toward Lawton, Frederick, Altus. And then for Texas, places like Childress, Paducah, Wichita Falls, down to the south, almost stretching toward the Abilene area, down toward the I-20 corridor. So anybody in the yellow region here definitely needs to be on alert for storms with damaging downburst winds and large hail today. So that's all we have for now. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.